Is Nintendo just coasting off nostalgia, or are we seeing the beginnings of a project to revive all of the greats of Nintendo's history as part of a strategy to ensure that they have forever games for the foreseeable future? I think the idea of them going back to nostalgic content certainly makes sense, and you can see with Star Fox and Ocarina of Time that there are some particular properties that they are looking to revive. The films themselves are also retrospective in nature, and of course, while Nintendo has always actually done a lot of looking back and reworking elements, it does feel like there's a lot of old content at the moment. Now, in the past, the handhelds have tended to be the venue for this. The Mario Advance series were almost all throwbacks to the past with just minor tweaks, and of course, the early 3DS also came along with quite a few remakes and remasters of prior titles. But the benefit of an early part of the generation is that they can reuse old content and give the new technology a chance to work its magic, so that old games can be played as new. However, that is something which Nintendo is not going to be able to do forever, and so I think there is something deeper happening here. You see, for decades, games have been at the cutting edge of the technological progress rate, but that rate of progress is, in practical terms, probably starting to slow. Now, sure, in terms of total memory and all sorts of other graphical and AI features, it may continue to expand and develop, but I think the effect on the audience is probably plateauing, at least without it developing into some completely different kind of experience, such as virtual reality or whatever else. So compare this with film. In the late 1880s, the very first experiments with photographs in motion were created, and there are well-known and legendary pioneers of the field from this era, like the Lumiere brothers, but it was really the 1920s and 30s when the art form reached a stage where it's recognisable today. Think Nosferatu, Charlie Chaplin, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. From the 30s and 40s, we have some of the greatest films of all time, and ones that still hold up and feel relatively modern today, apart from obviously the differences in accent, dress, and outlook of the characters and the worlds. But of course, there are new technological developments that have come since. We've seen black and white give way to colour and then to 3D. We've seen digital animation, claymation, and all sorts of other variants on the form. Different practitioners have come in, such as the Japanese animation studios and other people who have decided to enter the film industry. It's not that the film industry has stayed static. However, in a more fundamental sense, I think you could say that the 20s and 30s are pretty recognisable today as the same art form, whereas the films of maybe just 10 or 20 years prior were not, because we don't even have the idea of pianos being in the corner of the cinema anymore. And I think games are kind of in this state where films were in the 20s and 30s right now. Previously, we had big explosions in the capacity of games to deliver great experiences. So the emergence of the 8-bit console technology allowed for the fluidity and scope of games like the Super Mario Bros. Original game, Zelda, Metroid, and more. Then we had the 32 and 64-bit technology, which brought us the conventions of 3D games, polygonal graphics, and analog triggers, and all of that great stuff. Then the Wii and DS era integrated motion and touch, but things are rather different now. You see, the Switch changes how you can access console-level technology, but it doesn't change the tech on a fundamental level. There are obviously small tweaks and things that have been invented, but there's nothing really substantial on the level of the touchscreen or the motion controls. And also games that were released in bygone eras just don't feel all that dated in the way that some games that were 10 or 20 years old in the past felt. See, I grew up with 16-bit technology and prior, but I find it difficult to revisit even games I once adored because they just do feel quite dated now in terms of their interface. But the core of those games was always incredibly strong. I had hours and hours, hundreds of hours of great experiences with 16-bit games. And I think now we're seeing titles that can be renovated with a bit of care and attention being taken off the shelves and dusted down. And of course, we see that most obviously with the new Star Fox. The thing is, Star Fox 64 was always inevitably a product of its time. The graphics were a snapshot moment in history, cutting edge then, but quite quaint now, as all cutting edge graphics always end up being. But the new Star Fox Well, that can be a product for all time. They can feasibly sharpen and tweak it, they can expand, remix, but it's difficult to imagine there being another definitive version of this game unless, of course, they want to give it a new skin and give it a more cartoony aesthetic to appeal to somebody at some point in the future. I think fundamentally, this is the version of Star Fox 64 that is going to last basically for all time, give or take the odd change here or there. And the thing is, Switch 2 includes access to the whole past Switch library, and so it's now possible for many of those titles that were iconic in the past to continue to be iconic into the future. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Zelda Link's Awakening, Breath of the Wild. Previously, backwards compatibility was a limited feature. Nintendo often would allow one console generation to be backwards compatible with the previous one, but they wouldn't allow an ongoing process because, apart from anything else, the technologies were too different. But I think that would now be quite difficult. It seems reasonable to assume that, all things being equal, they will find a way for people to be able to access their libraries of Switch 1 games on the Switch 3 or whatever console technology follows, as long as there's not too big a technological leap. And I think that means that titles that are released now can be expected to be on the shelves generations from now. But what does that mean? Well, for one thing, it'll mean that there is a huge library of titles for Nintendo in every single series. In the past, we've been used to having just one or two Metroids or Kirby's or even Mario's on a shelf during the lifespan of a console before inevitably they give way to a new generation. But now those games are going to stay there. Some of these are on Nintendo Switch Online, of course, but even this gives Nintendo a bit of an insight into how they can be used. They now have precise play data for their current audience in how they interact with their retro games. They know who's playing these games, and crucially, they know how they're playing them. Where are they giving up? What kinds of activities do they do in these games? How long do they spend playing them? Do they revisit them? They can see which titles would benefit from a resuscitation, and they also know which titles probably are best left. And they have time. This completely changes the profit-loss calculations on these titles. Metroid Prime Remastered, for example, we know that game sold less than 2 million after a year and change on the market. However, with perhaps only modest changes and nothing else, perhaps a graphical uplift for the new systems, but no big Metroid push, no big Metroid film or anything like that, I think we could expect in 10 years it might creep past 3 million. In 20 years, maybe it would reach 4 million, and so on. Perhaps, I grant you, they will just use it as part of their streaming library. It won't make money for them as an individual title, but it will still be part of the overall offer of value for Nintendo. But I think many of their games could continue to sell indefinitely at a trickle on this kind of basis. Now, this is a great opportunity, but it also provides difficulties. Many past titles have been iterations or evolutions of the one that came before. Switch Sports after Wii Sports, Super Metroid after Metroid, Super Mario World after Super Mario Bros. 3, A Link to the Past after the original Zelda. Indeed, if you look at many of Nintendo's series, they are kind of reiterating the same game again and again. It's most obvious with Star Fox, but if you look at Breath of the Wild, they were really going back to the original Legend of Zelda and trying to bring that back to life, just as you can see a continuity between the original Zelda and A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, and then Breath of the Wild. And all of this was fine because new tech gave them new bites at the cherry. They were able to do something new and different each time, and it was something that people received not just as exciting for the nostalgia, but exciting for the new opportunities. These games were recreated each generation. Now, I don't think we're quite done with that era yet where things could be recreated as new in a much more expansive and interesting way using new technology, but I think there is a natural limit to what new technology might provide while being still recognisably the kinds of games we're experiencing. Obviously, one day we might get the Star Trek holodeck, but in the same way that films, I think, are broadly still recognisable from 100 years ago, I think the kinds of games we're seeing now will still be broadly recognisable for a very long time to come. Do we need or require a world bigger in scope than Breath of the Wild? Well, probably not. Do we need graphics significantly more luscious than Mario Kart worlds? I'm not sure. Do we need audio quality that is significantly better than even Wind Waker or games from 20 or 25 years ago? And you can see on Nintendo Music how popular those tracks are, and I don't think any of those are going to date anytime soon. Music already has basically plateaued in terms of Nintendo's capacity to feel completely modern. I don't think anybody is going to be surpassing Gusty Gardens on a regular basis anytime soon. But that means that each new game has to compete not just against the immediate competition, against Sony or whatever else that they're competing with, but against the back catalogue of Nintendo's own titles. And we've already seen a bit of this. So Mario Kart World, for example, had to do things that were inconceivable with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. But Mario Kart 8 Deluxe already exists. If you want traditional course-based Mario Kart, there really is no more popular or expansive title on offer. World is trying to do something quite extreme and quite different to set itself apart. We saw the same as well with Super Mario Bros. Wonder, where Takashi Tezuka explicitly said that he was thinking about the way that people felt there was no need for a new Mario after Mario Maker because people could basically make their own courses, and so had to create a game which would be impossible to have created using Mario Maker. But on a system where people can play nearly every prior 3D Mario, the new 3D Mario can't just remix what went before, but needs to offer something qualitatively, not just quantitatively, different. At the same time, the risks are higher with changing things up because, of course, people are going to look at something new and feel like it's not quite what they expected or what they wanted, and it brings an element of risk. We can see with Donkey Kong Bonanza that although it was very well received with a number of people, not everybody seemed to enjoy the new smashing mechanics, and that's always a risk you take when you try something different. All the more reason then to balance backward-looking revisions of old content with new ideas, and especially when this gives a chance to orientate new development groups and to ameliorate the development costs of all new titles. Hence we get Echoes of Wisdom following on from Link's Awakening, and Emi the Smiling Man following from the revived versions of the Famicom Detective Club cases. Nintendo has a vast library, but it is ultimately finite in scale. There will come a time, probably not 10 years, but maybe 20 or 30 years from now, when they will have picked much of the low-hanging fruit that exists. Realistically, there are, maybe a couple of hundred titles that could really sell and draw big crowds in a complete modern remade form. And there will probably come a time when they have brought all of those up to reasonably modern standards. And only a few dozen of those would really sell right at the top end in the Ocarina of Time or even the Star Fox bracket. But also, there isn't always the room to significantly reinterpret those games. I could see a new version of Twilight Princess, possibly even Wind Waker, but is there that much extra leeway in Skyward Sword? Maybe one day, but I think it'll probably be a long, long time before that demand emerges. However, even then, Nintendo have other solutions. I don't necessarily think Nintendo Switch 2 editions will be the end of updates to some of these titles. Something like Breath of the Wild, well, I think that could be updated and developed basically forever. If and when Nintendo reach new hardware, there's nothing to stop them revisiting, expanding, sharpening the graphics, and just tweaking it to make sure it's a truly great version of the title that people love. It's going to continue to sell, it's going to continue to be a major part of Nintendo's game lineup, and I don't think that's going to change even if the technology does. Done right, it means that Nintendo can ensure a long-term baseline income that is resilient to changes, and that's a really positive thing. But there are other things that they need to think about. Yes, they've probably got about 20, 30 years of being able to balance these older concepts with newer material, but they also are going to need to plant seeds now for the future in terms of brand new ideas. If they expand their game studio sufficiently, they should be able to continue to release maybe a game a month on average in an indefinite basis, including a breadth of properties with new versions of major titles coming out every now and then. Obviously, those titles will need to be sweated over quite a bit more, and maybe there will be more risk in releasing them because they will need to stand out from what went before, but that's just part of the creative process. But they're also going to need to ensure that there are new concepts bedded in there, and it doesn't necessarily mean that these will be part of the video game space. Most companies do seek to grow, or at least that's the imperative. Whether it's advisable or not is another matter, but there's a sense that you either evolve or stagnate. Hence, I think we've seen Nintendo looking well outside the video game space recently with projects like Alama in the lifestyle space or Hello Mario in the toy space, new mobile projects such as Pictonico, as well as, of course, their theme park and film initiatives. And I think this is something that Nintendo is thinking about, not just in terms of utilizing its IP to make money, although that is obviously part of their motivation, but also in terms of giving them a security for the long term. Because while the video game industry is strong at the moment, things might change. And actually, when there is such a bulk of content already out there, and when they're competing with themselves, there may come a point where they just don't have the creative inspiration to really break forward into something different. There will come a point where the law of diminishing returns kicks in, even with something as iconic as Mario and Zelda. And at that point, Nintendo does need to be able to pivot to something new, even if it's just to give a rest to some of these classic properties and to allow their golden oldies to sell and keep them going as they reorientate themselves, as they've done many times over the previous decades and over a century that they've been in business. At any rate, these are just my thoughts at the moment. Please do consider checking out the Patreon for early, ad-free and exclusive content. And I will say thank you for watching and look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.